David stepped off the small propeller plane, his boots crunching against the packed snow. The chill of the Arctic air hit him like a slap, and he adjusted his scarf, feeling both exhilarated and a bit apprehensive. He had spent years studying geology, diving deep into research papers and textbooks, but nothing had prepared him for the stark beauty of Svalbard. The Norwegian archipelago was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a pristine wilderness of towering glaciers, jagged peaks, and endless expanses of ice and snow. This was David's first expedition to the Arctic, part of a groundbreaking study on the effects of climate change on glacial retreat. The opportunity to work in such a remote and challenging environment was a dream come true, even if it was slightly intimidating. He was leading a small team of researchers, all equally awed by the unspoiled beauty surrounding them. The base camp was a modest collection of tents and equipment, perched on the edge of a vast fjord. From there, the team would make daily excursions to the glaciers, collecting data on ice thickness, temperature, and retreat rates. It was grueling work, but David relished the challenge. What captivated him most, however, was the Arctic wildlife. From the moment he arrived, David found himself drawn to the animals that called this frozen expanse home. Seabirds darted overhead, their cries echoing through the fjords. Arctic foxes scampered across the tundra, their white coats blending seamlessly with the snow. Occasionally, seals could be seen lounging on chunks of ice, their glossy bodies glistening in the pale sunlight. But one animal loomed large in his mind, the polar bear. Polar bears were the undisputed rulers of this icy domain. David had read about their power and grace, but he had yet to see one in the wild. The prospect thrilled and unnerved him in equal measure. He knew the dangers. Polar bears were apex predators, and encounters with humans could be deadly. To prepare, David and his team underwent rigorous training. They learned to handle rifles, set up tripwire alarms, and recognize bear tracks. They were taught how to stand their ground if a bear approached, but David hoped he'd never have to put that knowledge to use. One evening, as David stood outside his tent, he gazed across the fjord. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape. The stillness was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of ice or the distant call of a bird. For the first time in years, David felt a deep sense of peace. He was in one of the most remote places on Earth, far from the noise and chaos of civilization, and he couldn't wait to see what the Arctic had in store for him. Little did he know, his journey would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would leave an indelible mark on his life. The day started like any other. David and his team had spent hours collecting samples from a nearby glacier, their breath visible in the freezing air as they worked. By late afternoon, they were packing up their equipment, eager to return to camp before the temperature plummeted further. The sunlight was dimming, casting long shadows over the ice. It was then that they heard it, a strange, distressed sound echoing across the water. David froze, his senses immediately on high alert. The sound was unlike anything he had heard before, a plaintive cry that seemed to rise and fall, carried by the wind. The team exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you think it is?" one of the researchers asked. David shook his head. "I'm not sure. Let's check it out." They moved cautiously toward the shore, their boots crunching against the ice. As they neared the edge of the fjord, they spotted the source of the commotion, a small polar bear cub struggling in the icy water. The sight made David's heart lurch. The cub was clearly in trouble, its tiny paws scrabbling at the edge of a floating piece of ice, unable to haul itself out. Its fur was matted and soaked, clinging to its fragile frame, and its cries were growing weaker. "Where's the mother?" someone whispered. David scanned the horizon, his pulse quickening. If the cub's mother was nearby, they could be in serious danger. An adult polar bear was a force to be reckoned with, and they had little more than rifles for protection. But as they searched the landscape, there was no sign of the mother. The cub appeared to be alone. "It must have fallen off the ice," David said, his voice tight. "We can't just leave it." The team hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. David felt a surge of determination. He couldn't stand by and watch the little creature drown. Grabbing a rope and a kayak, he prepared to act. "David, are you sure about this?" one of his colleagues asked, concern etched on her face. "We don't have a choice," he replied. "If we don't help, it's not going to make it." With that, he slid the kayak into the freezing water and paddled toward the struggling cub, unaware that this moment would change his life forever. The icy water sent a chill through David's body as he slid the kayak off the shore, gripping the paddle tightly. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and his heart raced with both fear and determination. The polar bear cub was still floundering in the water, its cries weaker now, as if exhaustion were setting in. David knew he didn't have much time. Behind him, his team stood watching, their faces a mix of concern and trepidation. One of them held the end of the rope David had tied to the kayak, ready to help pull him back if things went awry. "Be careful, David," one of them called, her voice trembling. David nodded, his focus locked on the struggling cub. With steady strokes he paddled closer, the icy water lapping against the sides of the kayak. The cub noticed his approach and turned its wide, frightened eyes toward him. It flailed harder, trying to stay afloat, but its movements were erratic, and it kept sinking slightly before clawing its way back up. "Easy there, little one," David murmured under his breath, as if the cub could understand him. He didn't want to frighten it further, but he also knew that time was running out. When he got close enough, he tried to loop the rope around the cub, but it panicked, snapping its small jaws and paddling furiously away. The kayak wobbled precariously, and David had to steady himself to avoid tipping over. He cursed under his breath, realizing the cub's fear was making the rescue even more difficult. "Come on, work with me here," he muttered. He decided to change tactics. Instead of trying to lasso the cub, he used the paddle to gently guide it toward the shore, creating a barrier between the cub and the open water. The cub resisted at first, but as its energy waned, it began to follow the path David was carving for it. "Almost there," David said, his voice steady but strained. His arms burned from paddling, and his fingers were numb from the cold, but he pushed on, refusing to give up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cub reached the shallows near the shore. David jumped out of the kayak and waded through the frigid water, his boots crunching on the ice beneath the surface. He grabbed the fur on the back of the cub's neck, ignoring the sharp pain as its teeth grazed his wrist. The cub thrashed weakly, but David held firm, dragging it onto dry land. His team rushed forward to help, pulling the sodden cub fully out of the water. The little bear lay there for a moment, its chest heaving as it caught its breath. Then, without warning, it scrambled to its feet and bolted into the tundra, its small frame disappearing into the vast white landscape. David collapsed onto the icy ground, gasping for air. His wrist throbbed where the cub had bitten him, but he didn't care. He watched the cub vanish into the distance, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "You did it!" one of his colleagues said, helping him to his feet. "You saved it." David nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I just hope it survives out there." The rescue stayed with David long after the cub had vanished into the tundra. That night, as he sat by the campfire nursing his injured wrist, he couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind. The cub's desperate cries, the feel of its sodden fur beneath his fingers, and the moment it had run off without looking back. All of it weighed heavily on him. One detail stood out more than anything else, the notch in the cub's left ear. It was a small, distinctive mark, as if a piece had been taken out in a fight or some other mishap early in its life. The mark gave the cub a unique appearance, one that David knew he wouldn't forget. "What do you think will happen to it?" one of his teammates asked, breaking the silence. David stared into the fire, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. It's strange that its mother wasn't around. Polar bear cubs don't usually survive on their own at that age." "Do you think we should have done more?" another teammate asked. David shook his head. "We did everything we could. It's up to the cub now." He wanted to believe the little bear would adapt, that it would find a way to survive in the harsh Arctic environment. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging worry that it might not make it. The thought of the cub struggling alone in the icy wilderness tugged at his heart. As the days passed, David threw himself back into his work, but the memory of the rescue lingered. Every time he saw a polar bear track in the snow or heard the distant call of an Arctic fox, he thought of the cub. He found himself scanning the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of the small bear with the notched ear, but it never appeared. For David, the experience was more than just a rescue. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life in the Arctic and the interconnectedness of all living things. The cub's plight had touched something deep within him, leaving an emotional impression that would stay with him for years to come. David's life moved forward like the slow, steady advance of the glaciers he once studied. After completing his PhD, he transitioned into postdoctoral research, moving between projects that took him to far-flung corners of the globe. His expertise in geology and climate science became highly sought after, and he found himself buried in data, presentations, and expeditions to study the impacts of global warming. Yet, despite the excitement and busyness of his work, David's thoughts occasionally drifted back to the Arctic and the polar bear cub he had rescued. He remembered the weight of its sodden fur, the desperate look in its eyes, and the distinctive notch in its ear. He often wondered what had become of the cub. Had it found its mother? Had it managed to survive? Those questions lingered in the back of his mind, unanswered but not forgotten. The years turned into nearly a decade, and life swept David along in its current. Svalbard became a distant memory, a chapter of his life he looked back on fondly but rarely revisited. The vast frozen landscapes had left an indelible mark on him, but his work now focused on other regions, and the urgency of climate research kept him tethered to the present. Then a call came that pulled him back to where it all began. A new project required an experienced team to study the rapid retreat of glaciers in Svalbard, and David was asked to lead the expedition. It felt like fate, a chance to return to the place that had shaped so much of his early career. When David and his team arrived, the changes were staggering. The glaciers he had once studied had receded dramatically, leaving behind exposed rock and meltwater lakes. The Arctic landscape, though still beautiful, bore the unmistakable scars of a warming planet. Setting up camp near one of the glaciers, David couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia. The familiar chill in the air, the distant cries of seabirds, and the shimmering northern light at dusk brought back a flood of memories. But as he busied himself with organizing the team and preparing for the fieldwork, he brushed aside thoughts of the past, focusing instead on the task at hand. Still, something about being back in Svalbard stirred a restlessness in him. He found himself scanning the horizon more often than usual, as if expecting to see something, or someone. The polar bear cub crossed his mind more than once, and he wondered if the vast wilderness had allowed it to grow and thrive, or if it had been swallowed by the unforgiving Arctic long ago. On the third night of the expedition, the stillness of the Arctic was shattered by a loud crack, followed by a series of rapid pops. The tripwire alarms around the camp had been triggered, and David jolted awake in his tent, his heart pounding. Shouts echoed through the camp as the team scrambled to assess the situation. "Polar bear! It's close!" someone yelled. David threw on his jacket and boots, grabbing the rifle that was standard issue for Arctic expeditions. He emerged into the dusky light, the summer sun hovering just below the horizon. One of the team members pointed toward the edge of the camp, where a large shadow moved against the stark whiteness of the tundra. "I'll take over," David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Go back inside and secure the tents." He took his place as night watchman, pacing the perimeter of the camp with the rifle in his hands. His breath came in visible puffs, and the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground seemed deafening in the quiet. Then he saw it. A polar bear stood in the distance, its massive frame illuminated by the faint Arctic light. It wasn't unusual to spot polar bears near camps, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the bear's size or its deliberate movements. It was the way it stopped and stared directly at him, as if it recognized him. David raised the rifle, ready to fire a warning shot if the bear came closer. Through the scope, he studied its features: the powerful build, the swaying gait, the sharp black eyes. But then his focus landed on its left ear and he froze. There it was, a distinctive notch, just like the one he had seen on the cub all those years ago. His heart caught in his throat. Could it really be the same bear? He lowered the rifle slightly, his mind racing. The bear sniffed the air, its gaze fixed on him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as man and animal regarded one another across the icy expanse. David felt a flood of emotions: awe, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of connection. The bear took a few tentative steps closer, its movements cautious but not threatening. David held his breath, his grip on the rifle loosening. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the Arctic wilderness. David stood there, the cold biting at his skin, his mind reeling with what he had just witnessed. It wasn't until the bear was out of sight that he realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled deeply, his chest tight with a mix of exhilaration and relief. Looking down at his wrist, he saw the faint white scar left by the cub's bite, a reminder of the moment their paths had first crossed. It seemed impossible, yet he couldn't shake the feeling. The cub he had rescued all those years ago had returned, now a magnificent adult, as if to thank him for the second chance he had given it. David stood rooted to the frozen ground, his breath catching in his chest as he watched the bear retreat into the tundra. The pale Arctic light shimmered off its fur, but his eyes were drawn to the notch in its left ear, an unmistakable marker of the cub he had pulled from the icy waters 8 years ago. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only him and the memory of that desperate rescue. The bear paused and turned back for one last look, its black eyes locking with David's. The gaze wasn't hostile or indifferent. It held a sense of curiosity and familiarity. David's pulse quickened. Did the bear recognize him? It seemed impossible, but the way it lingered, the way it sniffed the air and tilted its head, made David wonder. The Arctic's raw, untamed beauty had always held its mysteries, but this felt profound. His hand instinctively went to his wrist, brushing the faint scar left by the cub's bite. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, a mix of disbelief and emotion washing over him. 8 years had passed, yet here they were, face to face once again, both older, both survivors of the relentless Arctic. The bear lowered its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost contemplative. For a moment, David felt the weight of the wilderness lift, replaced by an unspoken connection that transcended species. He wanted to reach out, to say something, to express his gratitude and wonder, but he knew better. This was a wild animal, magnificent and powerful, and its life belonged to the vast expanse of ice and snow. The bear made no move to approach further. It simply lingered, as if it, too, was taking stock of the moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, it lumbered back toward the horizon, leaving David standing in awe. He watched until its massive frame became a dot in the distance, swallowed by the endless Arctic. When the bear was gone, David let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was still racing, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. It wasn't just the bear's presence that left him shaken. It was the recognition. He was certain now. This was the same cub he had saved, grown into a majestic adult, strong and resilient. David sat down on a nearby ice mound, his legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline. He buried his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. It was more than a reunion. It was a testament to survival, to second chances, and to the delicate balance of nature. In that moment, he understood something profound. The Arctic, for all its harshness, had a way of preserving its secrets and rewarding those who cared for it. The bear had not only survived, it had thrived. And in doing so, it had gifted David a memory that would stay with him forever. The camp was stirring as the first hints of morning light broke through the Arctic's perpetual dusk. David, however, hadn't slept a wink. Instead, he sat near the edge of the camp, notebook in hand, writing feverishly. Every detail of the encounter with the bear poured onto the pages. The notch in its ear, the way it had paused to look back at him, the almost serene way it had walked away. He closed the notebook and stared out at the horizon, where the bear had disappeared hours earlier. It struck him just how far the cub must have come. Alone in the Arctic, without its mother, it had faced challenges few could imagine: the struggle for food, the threat of predators, and the harshness of a changing climate. Yet it had survived, and not just survived, but thrived. Its sleek coat and powerful frame spoke of a life lived with resilience and determination. David felt a surge of pride, though he knew he couldn't take full credit. The bear's survival was a testament to its strength and adaptability, but it was also a stark reminder of how fragile the Arctic ecosystem truly was. The cub's story was a symbol of hope, but also a call to action. Determined to make the most of the encounter, David began planning how he would share this story. His team needed to know, of course, but beyond that, he saw an opportunity to inspire others. He envisioned writing an article, perhaps even a book, detailing his experiences in the Arctic and the incredible moment of reconnecting with the bear he had once saved. This is why we protect these places, David thought, not just for the beauty, but for the lives that depend on them. He shared the encounter with his team over breakfast, their eyes widening as he recounted the details. Some were skeptical, but most were in awe. "If that's really the same bear," one colleague said, "it's nothing short of a miracle." David knew it was the same bear. The scar on his wrist was a constant reminder, a mark left by the cub that had, in its own way, left a mark on him. As the day unfolded, he found himself more motivated than ever to continue his work in the Arctic. The glaciers, the wildlife, and the untouched wilderness weren't just research subjects, they were treasures worth protecting. The encounter became a symbol for David and his team, a reminder of why they were there and the impact their work could have. As he stood at the edge of the camp that evening, watching the sun dip low over the ice, David made a silent vow to share the story of the polar bear cub and its journey of survival, and to fight for a future where moments like these could still happen. David stood motionless as the polar bear, now a majestic adult, paused and stared directly at him. Its eyes held a mixture of curiosity and recognition, as if it too remembered the connection they had shared all those years ago. The Arctic wind howled around them, yet the moment between man and bear felt eerily silent, suspended in time. The bear lifted its snout to the air, inhaling deeply. Its massive frame stood steady against the icy backdrop, a testament to the resilience it had built over the years. David's grip on his rifle loosened, his instinct to protect himself replaced by an overwhelming sense of trust. He whispered softly, "It's you, isn't it?" For a moment, the bear remained still, as if acknowledging his words. Then, without haste, it turned and began lumbering away into the tundra. Its powerful strides left deep tracks in the snow, but David couldn't bring himself to move or call out. He simply watched, his breath visible in the frosty air as the bear faded into the distance. As the figure disappeared into the Arctic horizon, David finally exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to release years of unanswered questions and lingering doubts. The scar on his wrist, a faint white line from the cub's bite, seemed to tingle in the cold. He glanced down at it and smiled, the memory of the terrified cub he had rescued flashing vividly in his mind. David knew he might never see the bear again, but that didn't matter. The sight of it thriving in its natural habitat, strong and capable, was enough. It was a rare victory in a world where nature so often bore the brunt of human interference. As he trudged back to camp, the weight of his rifle felt lighter. The Arctic landscape around him, though vast and desolate, seemed to hum with life and possibility. The encounter had reaffirmed something David had always believed, but often forgot. Every small act of compassion, every decision to protect rather than harm, rippled outward in ways that were often unseen. When he reached the camp, the others were waiting, their faces etched with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. David nodded, a peaceful smile spreading across his face. "I saw a bear," he said simply. The team exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the dangers of such encounters, but David's calm demeanor reassured them. "Was it close?" another asked. David paused, considering how much to share. "Close enough," he said, the understatement carrying a weight only he fully understood. That night, as the Arctic sun dipped but never fully set, David lay in his tent staring at the canvas above him. The bear's image lingered in his mind, not as a threat, but as a symbol of hope. He fell asleep with the faintest smile, knowing the scars of their shared history would always connect them, no matter how far apart they were. Back in the settlement of Longyearbyen, David shared his extraordinary encounter with the rest of his team and the local community. His words were careful, almost reverent, as he described the moment he recognized the bear by the distinctive notch in its left ear. The story spread quickly, capturing the imagination of everyone who heard it. For researchers, the tale was a rare reminder of nature's resilience. Many marveled at how the cub, once so vulnerable, had grown into a powerful predator capable of surviving in one of the harshest environments on Earth. David's account inspired a renewed sense of purpose among his colleagues, fueling their dedication to Arctic conservation. But the story didn't stay confined to the research camp. As David documented the encounter and shared it with scientific journals and conservation groups, it began to reach a wider audience. Photos of the Arctic landscape accompanied his article, painting a vivid picture of the harsh yet beautiful world polar bears call home. David's story became a beacon for polar bear conservation efforts. People were captivated by the idea that a small act of kindness, pulling a struggling cub from icy waters, could ripple outward to make a lasting impact. Schools, universities, and environmental organizations reached out to David, inviting him to speak about his experiences and the importance of protecting Arctic ecosystems. For David, the scar on his wrist became more than a physical reminder. It was a symbol of his connection to the wild, of the life he had helped save. He often caught himself touching it absent-mindedly during conversations, a small gesture that reminded him of the cub's resilience and the bond they had shared. In the years that followed, David continued his research with a newfound determination. His work expanded beyond geology to include advocacy for wildlife conservation. He collaborated with polar bear researchers and environmentalists, lending his voice to campaigns that sought to protect the rapidly melting Arctic. The bear, though it never returned to the camp, became a legend in David's life. It was a story he told with pride, not for personal acclaim, but as a testament to the enduring power of nature and the impact of human compassion. Years later, as David stood at the edge of another glacier field, he smiled at the thought of the polar bear roaming the tundra, strong and free. He knew that the Arctic, with all its challenges and mysteries, was a place worth fighting for, and he knew, deep in his heart, that the encounter with the bear would remain the most profound moment of his life. As he walked back to camp, he glanced at the horizon one last time, half hoping to see a familiar silhouette. The bear was gone, but its legacy, the connection they had forged, would stay with him forever.